Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to be focusing on just one person's perspective, a pretty powerful perspective. The perspective of Nnamdi Kanu. Kanu is a complex guy, a controversial figure for sure. He leads a movement. In southeastern Nigeria, they're pushing for an independent nation they want to call Biafra. Now, you might have heard of him, you might even have some opinions about him, but we're going to try to set all that aside today. What we're after today is understanding, not judgment. We really want to explore the core ideas that drive this movement, the historical context that shapes Kanu's views, and all the controversies he stirred up along the way. It's going to be fascinating, I think. And I'm really excited to have our expert here to help us navigate all this.
It really is fascinating. It's interesting because Kanu's critique, it goes beyond just your typical political disagreements. He really challenges the very foundation of Nigeria as a nation.
Yeah, for sure. And that's exactly where we're going to start. Kanu argues that Nigeria, as it exists today, it's totally artificial and just a fundamentally broken construct.
Yeah.
He even has a problem with the name Nigeria, just the name itself. He sees it as a label that was slapped on by colonial powers, a name that's just loaded with all this negative baggage, racism, exploitation. He really sees it as this, legacy of a system designed to benefit just the people in power at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah, and that's such an important point to think about. This whole legacy of colonialism and how these totally random borders drawn up by these outside forces, how they still have such a huge impact on nations today. I mean, we see this all over the world, all these conflicts and tensions, they all stem from these imposed boundaries. It really makes you question, are these lines on a map? Are they really a true reflection of the people and cultures that they divide?
It's a really powerful question. Yeah, and it kind of leads us right into Kanu's vision for an independent Biafra. And this is where things get really interesting, I think, because the proposed map of Biafra, it's not based on the current state lines in Nigeria at all. It's actually based on this cultural marker where women traditionally tie their wrappers. So it's like a totally unique way to define a nation based on shared traditions and cultural identity rather than these, political boundaries.
It's a really fascinating concept, building a nation on shared culture instead of lines on a map. But of course, it raises some questions about how feasible that really is. Could such a nation actually be economically and politically viable? How would it even fit into all the existing power structures in the region? And thinking back to colonialism again, could a nation based on a shared culture, could that actually be more stable than one based on these random boundaries? That's a really good question, a question worth thinking about.
Totally. And Kanu actually has some very specific ideas about how he sees the economy of this new nation working. He talks a lot about free oil and gas as a key resource, not just for Biafra itself, but for all the neighboring countries as well. He sees Biafra as this prosperous place, not just for Biafrans, but for the entire region. So what do you make of that? What kind of challenges do you think that vision would face?
Well, I mean, offering free resources, that's a pretty bold move. It really signals a desire to break away from what Kanu sees as Nigeria's very exploitative approach to managing resources. It's a message that I think would definitely resonate. We're a lot of people in the region who feel like the resources haven't been shared fairly. But practically speaking, actually implementing a policy like that would be so complex. You'd have to think about the logistics, the potential impact on global markets, and of course the political will of all the surrounding countries. It's a very interesting idea, but definitely one that would need a lot of careful consideration and planning.
It does raise a lot of questions. And of course, we can't ignore the elephant in the room here. Kanu is a very divisive guy. He's been accused of inciting violence in some of his rhetoric. It can get pretty intense. I think we need to look at this side of things too, to really get a complete picture.
Absolutely. It's crucial to address all the controversies surrounding Kanu and to really examine some of his more inflammatory statements. And we're going to do just that in our next segment. We're going to delve into those statements and we're going to explore the whole complex dynamics of protest, self-defense, and the ethics of force in political movement.
It's a lot to unpack, and we're just getting started. Make sure you hit that like button. If you're finding this deep dive insightful so far, don't forget to subscribe to stay tuned for the next part. And join the conversation on our Facebook page. Tell us what you think about Kanu's critique of Nigeria. Does his focus on shared culture as the basis of a nation, does that intrigue you? We'll be back soon to continue this deep dive into the mind of Nnamdi Kanu.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the mind of Nnamdi Kanu. like we promised, we're going to dig even deeper now into some of the controversy surrounding Kanu and really look at some of his more, inflammatory statements. I think it's super important, though, to approach all this with some nuance, to remember the context so we can really grasp all the complexity.
Totally. We're going for understanding here.
Yeah.
And to do that, I think we got to look at the whole picture, even the parts that might make us a little uncomfortable. So, for example, there's Kanu's call for self-defense, which some people have interpreted as basically inciting violence. He's said things like, if you come to our land to kill us, we will kill you. Pretty strong words. So how do we square that with his vision of, a peaceful and prosperous Biafra?
I think it's vital to consider the context, the context in which he makes these statements. Kanu often frames his calls for action within this narrative of government oppression and violence against Biafrans, he argues, that they have a fundamental right to defend themselves against what they see as aggression. And he even draws parallels to these historical struggles for liberation.
So it's really a question of perspective then. He sees it as self-defense, but others see it as just a justification for violence.
Exactly. And this really brings up some important questions about the ethics of using force in political movements. When does a call for self-defense cross the line into inciting violence? How do we balance the right to resist oppression with the need to avoid escalating things and, preventing bloodshed? These are complicated dilemmas. There's no easy answers, but they're absolutely central to understanding all the controversy surrounding Kanu.
It's a lot to think about. And it really highlights, I think, the deep distrust that exists between Kanu's movement and the Nigerian government. And speaking of distrust, Kanu has been extremely vocal in his criticism of traditional media. He sees them as totally biased against him and his cause. And he's actually turned to alternative platforms, like Radio Biafra, to kind of control his own narrative.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating part of this whole movement. Radio Biafra gives Kanu this way to completely bypass all those traditional media gatekeepers and communicate directly with his supporters. It's a platform where he can share his message with no filter and build this direct connection with his audience.
It's a powerful tool for sure, but it also makes you wonder about misinformation, about the challenges of figuring out what's true in this age of information overload, especially when we're talking about these, alternative media sources.
Absolutely. It's so important for people to be critical consumers of information, no matter where it's coming from. We need to develop these skills, the skills to evaluate different perspectives, to understand the potential biases involved, and to really look for corroborating evidence before forming our own opinions.
That's a crucial point, and it's something we should all be thinking about as we navigate this increasingly complex media landscape. Now, something else that really stands out about Kanu is his just unwavering conviction. He seems so absolutely certain of his cause. In one speech, he even said that he already dead and that only Biafra can bring him back to life. What do you make of that kind of rhetoric?
Wow, that's powerful language, and I think it speaks to the profound emotional depth of his belief for Kanu. The struggle for Biafra isn't just some political goal, it's an existential imperative. He's willing to risk everything, even his own life, for what he believes in.
So it's a level of commitment that's really hard to grasp. And I think it explains why his followers are so devoted to him and his cause. They see him as a true believer, someone who's willing to fight for their aspirations.
Exactly, but it also brings up some important questions about the potential dangers of unquestioning belief. Even when you're dealing with these very compelling ideologies, it's so important to maintain those critical thinking skills, to question assumptions, to consider alternative perspectives, and to be wary of claims that lack evidence or that rely too much on emotional appeal.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? Finding that space where we can be passionate about our beliefs, but still stay open to different viewpoints and be willing to challenge our own assumptions. This has been a really insightful discussion so far, and we're just scratching the surface. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit that like button and subscribe to stay tuned for the final part of our exploration of Nnamdi Kanu's perspective. We want to hear from you too. Head over to our Facebook page and tell us what you think. What stands out to you the most about Kanu's rhetoric? And all the controversies surrounding him. How do you deal with all the complexities of information and rhetoric in this day and age? Let's keep this conversation going. We'll be back soon. To wrap up this deep dive into the mind of Nnamdi Kanu.
All right, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into Nnamdi Kanu. We've covered a lot of ground so far. His criticisms of Nigeria, his whole vision for Biafra, the controversy surrounding him, his incredible belief in his cause. Now I think it's time to zoom in on how he actually gets his message across. Kanu is a master of rhetoric, And I think to really understand his influence, you got to understand his language.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just about stating facts with him. It's about painting a picture, telling a story. He really connects with people on this deep level. And I think his use of language is a big part of that.
Oh, for sure. He uses all these powerful images, historical references, even humor sometimes, to create this compelling narrative.
So give us an example. What are some of his go-to techniques?
Well, one that really stands out to me is his use of religious language. He often frames the struggle for Biafra as this divine mission, invoking God's will, and presenting himself as this chosen leader.
Right. So it's not just about politics then. It becomes a matter of right and wrong, good versus evil.
Exactly, and this really taps into the deep spirituality of many Igbos. It adds this whole layer of moral authority to his claims.
It's interesting, and it's not just about appealing to faith either. He uses really strong language to get his points across, like when he calls Nigeria a zoo, depicting it as chaotic and uncivilized.
Oh yeah, that's a great example of how he uses these really stark contrasts to create these powerful images in your mind, Nigeria as this place of disorder, and then contrasting that with his vision of Biafra as this land of freedom and prosperity.
And he also brings up historical grievances a lot, reminding people of the Biafran War, the perceived marginalization of the Igbo people, all the broken promises of the Nigerian state.
That's a huge part of his strategy, tapping into those shared experiences. You know the pain, the injustice. It creates this sense of collective identity and a shared purpose. It's like he's saying, we've been wronged and we deserve better.
And he doesn't hesitate to name names either, calling out those he sees as responsible, both inside Nigeria and on the international stage.
Yeah, his anti-colonial rhetoric is really potent. He accuses the West, especially the UK, of propping up this corrupt Nigerian government just for their own benefit. And that message, it resonates with people who feel exploited and ignored by the global power structure.
It's like this classic David versus Goliath story, with Kanu casting Biafrans as the underdogs, fighting against this system that's rigged against them.
Exactly. And that narrative of defiance, it can be incredibly powerful, especially for people who feel marginalized and disillusioned.
So I've got all these elements: the religious language, the strong imagery, the historical grievances, the anti-colonial rhetoric. It's a powerful mix, and it helps explain why he's built such a devoted following.
Oh, definitely. And don't forget the role of Radio Biafra. It gives him this way to completely bypass the traditional media, which he sees as hostile to his message. And he can talk directly to his supporters.
It's his own platform, his own unfiltered channel, where he can shape the narrative himself.
Exactly. And having that control over the information, that's invaluable for any movement, especially one that's challenging the status quo.
So where does all this leave us after this deep dive? What have we learned about Nnamdi Kanu and his movement? What are the big questions that are still out there?
Well, I think it's clear that Kanu is a very complex and compelling figure. He's a gifted speaker who knows how to connect with people's emotions and their aspirations. He taps into those deep historical grievances. He offers this bold vision for the future, and he's not afraid to challenge those in power.
But he's also a controversial figure, and his methods have definitely drawn criticism. His rhetoric can be very divisive, and there are some legitimate concerns about the potential for violence.
Absolutely. And the future of his movement is still uncertain. There are so many factors at play: the Nigerian government's response, international pressure, the internal dynamics of the movement itself.
Yeah, it's a situation that deserves our attention, and it requires us to think about some complex issues.
You know, issues of identity, self-determination, and the legacy of colonialism.
Right. I think that's a key takeaway for our listeners: to stay informed, to be critical thinkers, and to engage in these conversations with nuance and empathy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's so easy to get caught up in the sound bites and the headlines, but we need to dig deeper to understand the historical context, the motivations, the challenges, and the human stories at the heart of all these complex issues.
That's it. Moving beyond simple judgments and engaging with the world in all its complexity. So on that note, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on Nnamdi Kanu's perspective? Do you find his vision for Biafra compelling or problematic? How do you navigate all the complexities of information and rhetoric these days? Head over to our Facebook page, share your insights with us. We'll be checking the comments and continuing the conversation over there. And don't forget to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more thought-provoking explorations of the ideas that shape our world. Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious.